many improvements to human civilization that's occurred over the course of my lifetime is that it's become much more socially accepted to criticize billionaires. The buffoonery of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos has dispelled a bit of the myth that these rich pigs are titans of industry that generated wealth from the font of their brilliance. And now we can have more and more fun reveling in their many obvious failures. But there's no reason to just clown on the billionaires of today. Why not go back and tell the story of how the richest man in Rome shat the bed? Welcome, one and all, to No One Is Competent, the premier history podcast bouncing all around the timeline of humanity to convince you that those in power are far less skilled at their job than the average barista, auto mechanic, or shelf stocker in general. I am Azalea, joined by the magnificent Jay. Our music is done by the legendary Sam Bryce, and you can find us on Twitter at Azalea Wyatt and at Jaharis48. Now, before we jump in, I'd like to remind you that this illuminating show comes to you with no sponsors, no advertisements, so we are begging on our knees, kowtowing a forehead an inch away from the pavement. Tell someone about the podcast. Do some commenting if you're on YouTube. Do some subscribing, some liking. If you're on Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star review. Give us a review. Give us a like, a diddle, whatever app you're on. Just diddle that algorithm for us, and we would really appreciate it because I personally am a very vain man, and I like it when people like my stuff. Jay, how vain do you think a person you are? Like, spectrum of humanity. Like, what percentile?
I don't know, maybe the 85th, 90th percentile.
Wow. That's high.
Yeah.
Well, I guess compared to me, most people are quite humble.
I suppose.
Speaking of my vanity, it's time for shameless self-promotion. So, I said this last episode, but once again, I made a movie, and it's called Bloom, and you can find it on the Wyatt the Warweaver channel, probably soon to be the Azalea channel. That's kind of what the film is about. It's 75 minutes long, but it's split into like a bunch of 3 to 4, some of them like 90-second chunks. You can kind of eat, you can kind of consume it bite-sized when you want. It took me many, many months and many, many panic attacks to make. And it's really, really cool, and I'm very proud of it, and I hope everyone watches it and enjoys it. So far, the response has been far more positive than I thought it would be. I kind of expected everyone I showed it to, including my friends and family, to go, well, that was interesting. But no, they seem to really genuinely like it, and I've gotten much better at detecting lies recently. So, that's all of the testimony you need. Watch it. It's, I don't know how to describe it to anyone. It's like biopic, documentary, essay thing. It's cool. There is a story. There's like at least 7 shots I'm pretty proud of. Sam Bryce, the guy who does our music, does the music for Bloom, wrote like 8 songs for it. So enjoy that on just a baseline level. Jay, what's something you've made recently?
Besides the script for this episode.
Besides the script for this episode.
Not much, really.
I don't know. Like, I feel like every time I talk to you, you've made, like, a new thing in a new, different genre or medium or form of art.
Yeah, I haven't really. I'm working on some things, which may or may not come into fruition. But I haven't really put anything out recently since, probably since, like, January or so. But if I do finish up with what I'm working on, then should be nice. Should be interesting. I'll leave it at that.
Fair enough. I guess we can jump right into today's episode. Cut down on chit-chat time. I always wonder how much people like random banter, because for me, when I don't know two podcasters, I don't want to hear them randomly banter. But when I do like two podcasters and I've got to know them, sometimes I like the random banter more than I like the actual meat and potatoes and asparagus of the podcast.
Yeah, I think
because I've cultivated one of those tasty, meaty, juicy.
Yeah.
Parasocial relationships.
I see.
I can fix that in post. I can fix that in post to make that sound great, I swear.
Just leave it in.
I probably will.
Yeah. So
hey, who the fuck are we talking about?
Today we're talking about Marcus Licinius Crassus, the so-called richest man in Rome. And our sources for today's episode, this is one of the fun ones where I get to use ancient sources, namely The Parallel Lives by Plutarch, translated by Bernardo Perrin, and Roman History by Cassius Dio, translated by Ernest Carey.
So, we are dealing with a Roman J, and obviously we're not going to spend 14 hours explaining Rome, partially because y'all do understand Rome a little bit. I'm sure most of y'all have heard the name Crassus at some point, even if it just was in 10th grade history. That name, it niggles in the back of your head. You're like, he did a thing. We'll get to the reason that you've heard of him. Don't worry. But Crassus was one of the figures that kind of comes into play in the sort of classic era of Rome. Roman history is weird because Rome existed for hundreds of years before it started really doing the things it got famous for. Eventually, it does these things called the Punic Wars and defeats Carthage at the end of the 3rd century BC. And that kind of makes Rome the Rome we think about. Jay, would you say that's fair?
Yeah.
The Mediterranean power.
Yes, yeah. The defeat of Carthage means that by the start of the 1st century BC, Rome pretty much directly or indirectly controls all of the Italian peninsula, as well as most of what's today Spain, Portugal, the southern coast of France, Greece, the Balkans, Tunisia, and Libya. And pretty much each decade, Rome is expanding more and more. It's it's a continuous just conquest.
And if you want to know more about that conquest and how battles were fought by the Romans, we suggest you listen to our Battle of the Teutoburg Forest episode that's going to take place 50-ish years after the events of this one. Don't worry about it. Anyway, what's weird is that, Rome will get really famous around all of Julius Caesar shit and whatnot we're going to go into. And then, there'll be the emperors everybody knows. And then people sort of, forget about the Romans for, 200 years because, not gonna lie, I have tried to study Roman history in the 3rd century, and it is hard mode. There are a lot of names.
Good old crisis of the 3rd century.
Yeah, there are a lot of 5-month emperors. But then and then Diocletian and Justinian were a thing, and that was cool. And then yada yada yada. We're gonna pretend that the Byzantine Empire is not the Roman Empire. Yada yada yada. Oh, they fell because of Attila the Hun. We gotta pay attention to sort of arbitrary little parts. But this is definitely going to be set in the Rome that people pay attention to. And it's also set in a point in history where I get to do some of my famous autistic ranting. Now listen, politically speaking, the Rome of this time is called a republic. This is called the Roman Republic. This is the Roman Republic era. But technically, Rome is an empire at this state, and I sometimes forget that people are not as pedantic as I am. And I will just refer to all of this as the Roman Empire, even though well, actually, Augustus started the Roman Empire.
Here's the thing,
it's like,
though.
obviously, it's a definition between like big E empire and small E empire.
If this was any other civilization, I would agree with you. But our word empire literally comes from the Romans. It's literally of Roman Latin etymology. And as a result,
multiple ethnic groups.
What?
They rule over multiple ethnic groups.
But I'm saying that our term empire comes from them, and therefore I think it's useful to use, the term republic and empire when you're talking about two different points in Roman history. Yes, from our modern definition, the Roman Republic is an empire, but from an actual, what is useful when learning about history, I think it's very unuseful to say, oh, this is the Roman Empire, when in this context, empire means something more than just, oh, they rule over multiple people.
No, I think it's perfectly fine to distinguish between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. You just have to acknowledge that you just have to, put the asterisks.
Yeah, so the Roman Republic is an empire, but
yes,
I think that referring to this as the Roman Empire is wrong, and if you keep on doing that, I will keep on interrupting you, because that's dumb.
I won't. I'm getting this out of the way because I want to point out that language is stupid and I don't like talking.
You never shut up, though.
I listen. I never said things I said that I did things I like to do. How the fuck does Rome work?
Yes. Empire and republic, again, mean something specific in the Roman context. It's not a sharp delineation between the two, because, technically the Senate continues all the way up through the Byzantines, but it means something politically when we're talking about different periods in Roman history. And in this period, Rome is a republic. There are no emperors. Now, the actual system of government is very complicated. We're not going to describe it in full detail because that would take quite some time. But basically what we need to know is that you have both the Senate, which is technically an advisory body. It's not quite like the Senate of the United States. And you also have a bunch of legislative assemblies, as well as magistrates who are elected by those assemblies and whose roles and numbers fluctuate with time. The top two magistrates are the guys known as the consuls. There are two of them. They're elected every year, and they're basically the head of state for Rome. Now, this system is basically intentionally complicated as a means of preventing any single individual from dominating the government. Rome used to be a kingdom, and this system is put in place when they overthrow the kings.
And it's relatively exceptional and very cool because of that. I mean, obviously all systems did have ways of distributing power. But essentially, the reason people like to talk about the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire is that it delineates the fact that by the time of the late Republic, power and influence were beginning to concentrate in the hands of a smaller and smaller number of generals and politicians, which would strain the system as the norms, shall we say, of Rome were broken down. And when it was over, power would be held, technically, in the hands of one person, the Roman Emperor. And that is where we set the scene of our play, in a civilization that has had, if you live in America, let's just say January 6th has happened, but 7 times already. And it's clear that democracy is really on its way out. And everyone's just kind of wondering who's going to be the guy to shove it over a cliff. That's kind of where we are in the Roman story right now. We've already had 2 centuries of the Gracchi brothers and the Marius and Sulla fight, which we'll get into a little bit. And let's just say Julius Caesar didn't just suddenly wipe it all out. There was many points of things being put on the camel's back that made it collapse.
Yes.
And that honestly could be an episode in itself. We're not going to do that or explain that because our story is going to be long anyway. But again, the key points are we're in the late Roman Republic era, and the democratic norms are still in place, but they're starting to slide. Or democratic's probably the wrong word. The power sharing norms are starting to slide, and people are beginning to get a little nervous. But we are also near the height of Rome's wealth and power and prestige.
Yeah.
In which there is a guy. Jay, who is the guy?
So our guy is Marcus Licinius Crassus. Now, Crassus is born around 115 BC, and he came from a plebeian family with a history of participation in politics.
Now, wait, Jay, I was told in school that the plebeians were the little guys in the society of Rome, and that the patricians were on top, and that's where we even get those words. What do you mean this plebeian was the richest guy?
Yeah, so this is one of those things where, like, what's in the school textbooks is generally, like, based on historiography from 100 years ago or something. Patrician-plebeian divide means very little by the late Republic. There are very few patricians left. Almost every famous Roman you've heard about from this era, except Julius Caesar, is a plebeian. You basically don't have to worry about it. The patricians are like people who are descendants from Romulus and Remus and some of the other early families, but there are barely any of them left, and there's very little divide between the two groups now. The Senate's full of plebeians, for example. So yeah, it's not important.
Yeah, if you're rich, your money spins.
Yeah. Now, Crassus's father served as a consul. Again, plebeian, yet he was a consul. And that is the highest position in the Roman government. His father was also a censor, as well as a governor in Spain.
Question.
Yeah.
Did consuls, did they make laws? Did they lead armies? How did they rule?
Consuls led armies, for sure, during major wars. Their main job was to enforce laws that were passed by the legislative assemblies or decrees that went through the Senate rather than make them themselves. They could
so they were like the president.
Yes, very much so.
And one thing I find fascinating about the office of consul is that it was a 1-year position. There's not a lot of time.
Yeah.
And that there were 2 at once.
Yeah.
So you see more distributions of power in this system. And I believe there were even at some points rules about how often you could be consul after holding the position once.
There were, yeah. Now, you could go on to get another job after you were consul called the censor, which I mentioned Crassus's father served as. And the censor is basically determined officially who got into the Senate, and also their job was to police public morality, hence the term censorship, and do stuff like that. But that was kind of like the retirement gig.
The censor is literally the crotchety old man telling girls to pull their skirts down to knee length.
Yeah. Now, Crassus's family are not notably rich. Plutarch's they all eat at the same table, which is a way of saying they're not fabulously wealthy. But I mean, they're very rich compared to the average Roman. They're just not wealthy compared to what Crassus would later achieve. And this prominent position in society would give Crassus a leg up when he would begin what would prove to be a highly lucrative career. Now, we don't really know exactly how Crassus started his business career. It's not when you're talking about modern billionaires when you can say they got their first job doing this or this. We kind of don't know with Crassus. It's just, a lot of details are lost to time. But we do know from a young age, Crassus seems to have obtained a reputation for avarice. And Plutarch actually tells us a story about this. He says that Crassus was once suspected of having a sexual relationship with one of the Vestal virgins.
Ooh la la.
Yeah. These were the priestesses of the goddess Vesta, who were sworn to celibacy. This sparked an official investigation, but Crassus ended up being cleared of any wrongdoing because it was revealed that he had been visiting and pestering the Vestal Virgin in an attempt to purchase a villa that she owned. That was it. Now, whether the story about the Virgin is true or not, it does relate to something Crassus would become famous for: his energy in amassing land. Property, rather than coinage, was how most prominent Romans held their wealth, and Crassus was no exception. We'll get a little bit more into that later.
There's a huge aspect of Roman wealth and, so to say, capital production this time is like massive plantation economies, right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, ancient world, almost every large society is agrarian. That's where the money comes from, fundamentally.
Yeah, rather than just fully being a merchant, you need to be producing crap. So we don't know much about Crassus' early life because, it was like 2,200 years ago. Give us a break. But from what we can tell, it was not particularly unusual for a young Roman from a powerful family. We can assume that his father intended for Crassus to follow along the cursus honorum, a path of political promotion that had become nearly institutionalized by the time of the late Republic. Crassus' predilection for business was perhaps greater than that of his contemporaries, but was not entirely unusual. Had Crassus been born at an earlier time in Roman history, he may have simply spent his life as a notable but unremarkable politician and businessman, working his way up the magisterial positions and becoming even wealthier all along the way. Crassus was born at a time of upheaval and violence, however, and his family would not go untouched by it. The main rivalry in Roman politics around the 80s BC was that between Lucius Cornelius Sulla and Gaius Marius, both powerful generals. This is a story you could make a movie about. We're gonna condense it very quickly. In 88 BC, Sulla, who was consul at the time, marched his army into Rome to essentially override the authority of his rivals in the government. I guess he didn't say a super cool line like the die is cast when he did it, so we now don't give a shit. The following year, Sulla departed Rome to prosecute a war in the east, and his allies in Italy proved unable to stop Marius from seizing control of the city and outlawing him. He's like, yeah, you left, you can't go back in the fort. Now, Crassus' father and elder brother had been supporters of Sulla, and were thus killed when Marius takes over the town and does a purge. Crassus flees to Spain and raises an army of 2,500 men. In the subsequent civil war between Sulla and Marius, Crassus, who was now in his 30s, would prove to be one of Sulla's most important commanders. It is during this war that Crassus formed a rivalry with one of Sulla's subordinates, one Gnaeus Pompeius, better known as Pompey. Or Jay's probably going to pronounce it Pompey.
It's Pompey.
Bro, you were literally pronouncing it as Pompey 2 days ago.
Did I? I was also very sick 2 days ago.
Yeah, sick in the head.
Like Crassus, Pompey was a member of a prominent plebeian family. Pompey's father was a general at the time of Sulla's march on Rome, but he refused to commit his forces to either side, earning him considerable disdain from the people. He was basically trying to just play both sides off of each other.
Won't Pompey be known for his indecisiveness for literally the rest of history for basically bad reasons?
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
He will get an undeserved reputation for
Very,
literally based on this one damn.
Yeah, one battle. But yeah. Unlike his father, Pompey was firmly in Sulla's camp, and soon gained considerable praise from Sulla as well as the men for his skill in warfare. That this praise was often in excess to what Crassus received would lead to a rivalry between the two that would last the rest of Crassus's life.
Everybody wants daddy's approval. Everybody wants to be daddy's special little boy, and Sulla liked you more than he liked me, so fuck you.
Yeah,
It all comes back to daddy shit, Jay.
it's like it's
Daddy
actually
issues all the way down.
it's actually during this war that Pompey gets the nickname the Great after some battles in Africa, and like it's like semi-mocking at this time, but still, he gets the fancy the Great title, and Crassus doesn't. Nonetheless, at the Battle of the Colline Gate outside of Rome in 82 BC, it was Crassus's forces that carried the day for Sulla, leading to Marius' suicide and the end of the conflict. Sulla followed up on his victory with a series of infamous purges known as the Prescriptions. Now, a prescription was a public order issued by the Roman government ordering the execution of an individual, as well as confiscation and sale of his or her property. Originally, it just meant the latter, but by this point, a prescription means, the person's dead or has been ordered to be killed.
Quoting from Plutarch's Life of Sulla. Be as it may, Sulla at once prescribed 80 persons, without communicating with any magistrate, and in spite of general indignation. After a single day's interval, he prescribed 220 others, and then on the third day, many more. Referring to these measures in a public harangue, he said he was prescribing as many as he could remember, and those who now escaped his memory he would prescribe at a future time. He also prescribed anyone who harbored and saved a prescribed person, making death the punishment for such humanity, without exception of brother, son, or parent, but offering anyone who slew a prescribed person 2 talents as a reward for this murderous deed, even though a slave should slay his master or a son slay his father. And what seemed the greatest injustice of all, he took away the civil rights from the sons and grandsons of those he had prescribed, and confiscated the property of all. So yeah, you remember I was talking about how, Crassus came up at a time when societal and government norms were sliding? This is what we mean.
Yeah.
Sulla's prescriptions were meant to destroy the Marian faction, and were largely effective at doing so. They also proved to be a bastion of corruption. That the property of condemned individuals was to be confiscated and sold by the state made the opportunity for profiting quite a bit off the event. The combination of this glut of property entering the market and the economic disruption waged by the wars meant that prices were low. Crassus would then use this opportunity to buy up immense amounts of property in these sales, and even went so far as to issue prescriptions on his own behalf in order to acquire new wealth, an act that would eventually cause him to fall out of favorship in Sulla. And this is interesting because Crassus's first bullet point about him, he's known as the rich man of Rome, or the richest man in Rome, or a wealthy guy.
Yeah.
And I think what goes to our mind is a wealthy landowner or a merchant. A merchant is what goes to my mind. But we've already seen, this guy is a general. He's led troops in battle, and spoiler alert, he's going to do that again. But there's a reason that he's not known as one of the great Roman generals. It's not even because he's a bad general. It's because there's something even crazier he's known for, which Jay is going to get into.
Yeah.
But it strikes me, though, that one interesting thing about history, or say civilizations, is that it kind of takes a certain it takes a certain sophistication for a society to have a rich man.
Yes.
As in a person who is just known for being rich. Not a king, not an emperor or a priest. Obviously, those could be rich. But just a rich guy.
Yeah.
You gotta have markets and trade and concentration of wealth and probably massive slave plantations to get that sort of thing rolling.
Yeah. Crassus is definitely one of the early ones. Now, it's in the aftermath of Sulla's civil war that Crassus went from a wealthy Roman individual to one of the wealthiest Roman individuals. Crassus's wealth was held not in coinage, but in his vast land holdings. Now, one of the most famous stories regarding Crassus's business practices is that of his firefighting scheme.
Oh, I really wanted to hear about this because, like, I learned about that. This is like a high school.
Yeah.
It was like, yo, Crassus used to like run firefighting stuff, but also it was like kind of a protection racket or extortion. Hey, I don't really know. Tell me about it.
Yeah. So Plutarch tells us, quote, "And besides this, observing how natural and familiar at Rome were such fatalities as the conflagration and collapse of buildings, owing to their being too massive and close together, he proceeded to buy slaves who were architects and builders. Then, when he had over 500 of these, he would buy houses that were afire, and houses which adjoined those that were afire, and these owners would let go at a trifling price owing to their fear and uncertainty. In this way, the largest part of Rome came into his possession."
So, like, what he's saying is that Rome is obviously a city at this point in history that's like, it ain't built to fire code.
No.
You've got tons of wooden and clay tenements and multi-story buildings that are crammed super close to each other with very narrow streets. Because Rome has to be restrained, right, in its confines. 'Cause it's like on a series of hills.
Yeah.
It can't Atlanta suburban sprawl. So obviously, like, when a fire happens, fires are going to happen all the time because people are dumb and fires get started and the structures are poorly built. So he uses that to then buy up the houses of people who really need to sell them.
Yes.
And don't have a lot of negotiating power.
Yeah.
And he's using his network of slaves to, like, do this buying, kind of so he can be everywhere at once doing this buying.
Yeah. And this is sometimes also like, there's a lot of reading between the lines that people sometimes do further. Like, the way I heard about it and the way I think a lot of people did is that, like, a Crassus would show up to a person's house on fire and offer to buy it, and if they said no, he would let it burn down. Plutarch never says that, but it's, when he's talking about Crassus buying architects and builders, the purpose of those is probably to put out fires if possible. So, like, that's the interpretation of what Plutarch is saying. But
Yeah, that is a little weird.
yeah, it's one of those things where, like, there's a very clear, like, myth that everybody hears, and Plutarch talks a bit about it, but Plutarch's, like, not super specific, unfortunately.
Yeah, the firefighting, the putting out of the fire is never mentioned.
No.
And that's probably because, like, what would happen on a practical level is that regardless of who paid who, this is Rome. This is the community would come together to fight the fire and put it out before it killed everyone.
Yes, generally people would try to unify
That is probably what would practically happen.
Yeah.
Because that's how communities work, is people relying on each other.
Yeah. Now, property in the Roman sense, of course, did not just mean land and buildings, but also those aforementioned slaves. Indeed, Plutarch claims that Crassus's slaves were his most valuable holdings, noting that, quote, "And though he owned numberless silver mines and highly valuable tracts of land with the laborers upon them, nevertheless, one might regard all this as nothing compared with the value of his slaves."
Plutarch estimates that by the time of his death, Crassus was worth around 7,100 talents in gold, up from 300 at the start of his adulthood. Quote, "The greatest part of this, if one must tell the scandalous truth, he got together out of fire and war, making the public calamities his greatest source of revenue." Now, you don't have to go on to the internet inflation calculator. This was $14.6 billion in gold worth today. But comparing the relative value of commodities across time, it's impossible to do so. So you can kind of spike that number higher in actual, like, ability to purchase things and control things. Needless to say, Crassus was very wealthy. Today he would be an owner of one of the largest corporations, say a Target or a Walmart or an Exxon Mobil or car company or whatnot. Obviously, if you've heard anything about Crassus, you've heard that he was the richest man in Rome, and the truth of this matter is hard to determine. It's certain that Crassus was one of the richest men in the city, and by the 70s BC, he was probably the richest, but we don't really know for sure. Whatever the case may be, Crassus established himself a reputation for wealth that was in excess of his contemporaries. He did so not only through his ruthless means in acquiring it, but his habits in using it. Ancient Rome, like many other societies, operated on a system known as clientelism. Oh, I'm so glad you put this in, Jay. I fucking love this fact. Because it's wild to me. Okay, so like, clientelism helps explain, if you were just an average Joe Schmo living in Rome at 60 BC, you're not going out and fighting in wars. That's happening hundreds of miles away. What are you just doing with your life? Well, you see, powerful individuals were expected to be patrons for a large number of clients. Now, clients could be relatives, employees, neighbors, renters, etc. Clients were expected to serve their patrons when called upon, and in exchange, patrons were expected to aid their clients by means such as providing loans, assisting them in finding new jobs, arranging marriages for their children, defending them in court, and the like. By the way, most of you probably have gracked. This is just gang shit. Like, when you hear the patron, that's literally the patron. That's the head of the crime family, and the rest of the people are the people in his gang.
Yeah.
Now, this arrangement extended into politics, with political figures essentially building up their popularity by providing services to their supporters and political allies, not unlike the machine politics of Gilded Age American cities. I mean, we get to the point where some people wouldn't even work. The clients wouldn't even work. They would just get all of their food stipend ration for the day from their patron, and then just kind of act as a street muscle in the gang wars of Rome.
Yeah,
because remember, people, cartels and gang shit, that is the natural way humans operate. Always have, always will. You get shit, you give it to people, then they're your people, and you go fuck up them. It's that all the way down. So Crassus uses his wealth and notable skills as an orator to establish himself as one of the top patrons in the Republic. Plutarch notes that he would frequently take up legal cases that Pompey and Cicero were unwilling to touch, and that he, quote, pleased people also by the kindly and unaffected manner in which he clasped their hands and addressed them. For he never met a Roman so obscure and lowly that he'd not return his greetings and call by name. This kind of reminds me of Joe Biden. Like, the only political strength I've ever heard of Joe Biden is that there are people who he met 30 years ago, and he sees them and he remembers their names. Being able to effectively glad hand someone and convince them that you like them is just a talent that can get you power.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll read about Crassus. Oh, he was uncharismatic and nobody liked him compared to Caesar and Pompey. And I think that's the case where he's definitely less popular than Caesar and Pompey, but that's also a very high bar. I think Crassus did have, a natural ability to glad hand and to win people over. A lot of people do follow Crassus, so I think he kind of gets a bit of the short end of the stick when people say stuff like that.
Yeah, it's like when you compare a raging wildfire to a nuclear bomb in the sun.
Yeah. Yeah.
You say, oh, that's not hot at all. You were missing the point.
Now, Sulla dies in 78 BC, leaving a power vacuum that would in time be filled by the likes of Crassus and Pompey. Pompey spent much of the decade engaged in wars on the borders of the Republic, building up his fame through military action, whereas Crassus focused his attention on Rome itself. Plutarch summarizes the relationship between the two men as such. Quote, "Now it vexed him that Pompey was successful in his campaigns, and was called Magnus, that is, great, by his fellow citizens. Renouncing, therefore, all efforts to equal Pompey in military achievements, he plunged into politics, and by his zealous labors, his favors as an advocate and moneylender, and his cooperation in all the solicitations and examinations which candidates for office had to make and undergo, he acquired an influence and repute equal to that which Pompey possessed through his great and many expeditions. And the experience of each man was peculiar, for Pompey's name and power were greater in the city when he was away from it, owing to his campaigns, but when he was at home, he was often less powerful than Crassus, because the pomp and circumstance of his life led him to shun crowds, retire from the forum, and render aid to a few only for those who asked it of him, and then with no great zest, that he might keep his influence the more unimpaired for use in his own behalf. But Crassus was continually ready with his services, was ever at hand and easy of access, and always took active part in the enterprises of the hour, and so by the universal kindness of his behavior won the day over his rival's haughty bearing. But in dignity of person, persuasiveness of speech, and winning grace of feature, both were said alike to be gifted."
Plutarch, I haven't done a ton of actual reading of Plutarch. He's kind of fun.
Yeah.
He knew it was important to tell stories, to make people into characters, and to give them notable, memorable qualities. And obviously, everyone kind of talks about how he moralizes it all and does shade, but sometimes that shade can be diplomatically catty and subtle in a way that is pretty funny.
Yeah.
He rendered aid to few only of those who asked him, and then with no great zest, that he might keep his influence the more unimpaired for use in his own behalf. That is very weaselly language.
Yeah. Yeah, no, Plutarch's fun.
Tension is, and obviously remember, Crassus is going to have more power in cities because he's the fat cat who's handing out money to everybody.
Yeah.
So the next big event that's going to go down is in 73 BC. Now, Crassus is in his mid-40s and is well established as the dominant political figure in Rome. Remember, this is when the average life expectancy for a human being is a lot, even a wealthy one, is much lower. So your 40s are like, if you're going to make it, that's when you need to be doing it. This was the year of Spartacus's famous slave rebellion, more formally known as the Third Servile War. But, I mean, we call it Spartacus's rebellion because Third Servile War is pretty lame. What began as a revolt of a small group of gladiators in Capua quickly snowballed into the most massive slave revolt in Roman history. Spartacus's army harangued the countryside, burning estates and freeing slaves, and managed to elude or defeat all Roman armies sent to stop it for over a year. After two armies led by then consuls of Rome were defeated by Spartacus, Crassus was called upon by the Senate to put down the rebellion. But he has not served militarily since the wars of Marius and Sulla.
Yeah, Plutarch even says that he got the job because he had a lot of friends in Senate. That basically that is what Plutarch implies. That yeah.
I mean, he's getting into his middle age. He's seeing Pompey kicking all this ass, and he says like, "Hey, I want to go remind people that I used to kick some ass, eh?"
And like, the two consuls were just defeated, so it's like, why not try Crassus?
But he was not an illogical pick. He was not a silly pick.
No, he did have military experience. It was a while ago, but it was there. It's not like he had never led men in battle.
Is he also like funding a lot of this army, like like a rich guy who could like raise the stuff? Or
Probably. We don't know, but probably.
yeah, so Crassus was able to quickly rebuild and reorganize the Roman army, again, probably with a lot of his own money, imposing harsh disciplinary measures, such as bringing back the practice of decimation for units that had shown cowardice in battle. Crassus' forces were able to push the rebels into the southern tip of Italy, where he then began constructing a long wall and ditch to essentially box in Spartacus' army. The rebels managed to escape their entrapment by crossing the ditch during a winter storm, but were defeated by the Romans in the Battle of the Salarius River in 71 BC. Spartacus was killed and the rebel forces were mostly destroyed. Crassus famously had 6,000 survivors of Spartacus' army crucified and strung up along the road from Capua to Rome. Here again, Crassus' rivalry with Pompey cropped up. The defeat of Spartacus was mostly Crassus' doing, with Crassus personally leading his forces at the Salarius River. Pompey, however, had arrived in Italy with his army, fresh from crushing an unrelated revolt in Spain, and Pompey's men were able to intercept and cut down many of the fleeing rebels. As such, Pompey wrote to the Senate, noting that while Crassus had defeated Spartacus, he had brought an end to the rebellion. Pompey was, in any case, awarded the honor of a major triumph for his victory in Spain, whereas Crassus would only settle for a minor triumph for his victory against Spartacus, as defeating slaves in battle was not seen as worthy of anything more elaborate. Just for context, a triumph is essentially like a parade orgy on crack thrown in Rome
Yes.
for your honor, and it's very, very fun. I do love that, like, oh, it's not important that you defeated slaves. It's like, 2 of your consuls died fighting this motherfucker.
Yeah. Yeah, he kind of got screwed over there, though, I mean, not going to have much sympathy for him. And, like, you can imagine why Crassus probably would have really wanted to put this down, because Crassus is a massive landowner.
Yeah, a
and
massive slave
holder. Yeah. Like, we don't know for sure, but he probably owned a fair bit of the property that Spartacus was burning. Now, the 2 rivals would temporarily set aside their differences and run for the offices of consul in 70 BC, easily winning. As co-consuls, they accomplished little due to their various disagreements, mostly petty in nature. Crassus's dislike of Pompey was such that when a soldier exclaimed that the 2 of them should be friends, he responded by stating that he would certainly love to be friends with a man who the people had awarded the title of the Great before he was even old enough to grow a beard, and who had been given a triumph before reaching the rank of senator. Basically just giving Pompey a really backhanded compliment.
Yeah, this is old high-class Roman shade right here.
Yeah. Now, Crassus and Pompey's relationship worsened further due to the latter's continued military successes. Pompey oversaw the final Roman victory in the wars against Pontus in Asia Minor, as well as the submission of Armenia in the Caucasus. These victories won Pompey great acclaim and wealth. Indeed, while Crassus was probably the wealthiest man in Rome beforehand, after the Mithridatic Wars, Pompey was almost certainly the wealthier of the 2. Remember, when we're talking about the Romans, going and fighting, they get rich because they are, plundering cities, extorting cities, capturing vast amounts of slaves and treasure and everything. And the guy on top obviously gets the lion's share of this. So leading an army of conquest is like the way to become the wealthiest in Rome. And Pompey does a lot of that.
Yeah, and I'm sure that, like, they only called Crassus the rich man because hypothetically he did not get his riches in, quote, maybe the honorable way.
Yeah.
Where he'll actually be less wealthy than some of the other people we're about to talk about.
Yes.
So while Crassus's relation with Pompey was rather poor, he could still count on the support of a great many other politicians and nobles, many of whom he had helped financially over the years. And chief among the people who had been financed by Crassus was this up-and-coming star named Gaius Julius Caesar. 15 years Crassus Jr., Julius Caesar was a member of a patrician family that had fallen out of favor due to being aligned with Marius in the struggle against Sulla. Indeed, Caesar's first wife was the daughter of Cinna. Sulla and Cinna, really? Marius' chief ally. I don't know why I find that funny. Sulla and Cinna. Arms locked together, strolling on to death. Anyway, Caesar just barely managed to avoid falling victim to Sulla's prescriptions due to having friends in Sulla's camp who argued on his behalf. He wisely spent the rest of Sulla's life away from Rome, fighting under other Roman generals in various campaigns. Only after Sulla's death, Caesar was able to return to Rome and earn a series of positions, including that of military tribune, quaestor, Quaestor. Fuck off. I have heard that was a really important position. And the Pontifex Maximus, essentially a priest. Caesar was very low on cash, however, and when he was appointed to the position of governor of western Spain in 62 BC, he was prevented from leaving Rome to take up his postings due to his considerable debts, and none other than Crassus stepped in to cover Caesar's debts, thereby making Caesar financially and politically indebted to him. Now, before you jump into the thing everybody knows, is it like we won't talk like a ton about Caesar, maybe in a different episode, but like at this point, he distinguished himself as like a very skilled military general, like above average.
Yeah, like he's made a name for himself in his fighting. He's seen as like an upcoming star, like
a really good guy to have you to owe you a favor.
Yeah. He's nowhere near as powerful as Crassus or Pompey at this point, but he's seen as an upcoming power. Now that the likes of Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus were amassing dangerous amounts of wealth and power was not something that went unnoticed by the Senate. Memories of Marius and Sulla were still strong, and whether it was out of a desire to preserve the Republic or maintain their own power in it, the Senate increasingly tried to stymie the plans of these powerful individuals. Now, individually speaking, none of these men could stand up to the power of the Senate, especially not if the Senate could win the other two to their side. Julius Caesar recognized that if the three of them joined forces, the Senate would be at the disadvantage. It was thus Caesar who proposed the creation of the first Triumvirate in 60 BC, quoting from Plutarch. Caesar, therefore, did not wish to make one of them an enemy by asking the aid of the other. He's talking about Crassus and Pompey here. Nor did he have any hope of success if neither of them helped him. Accordingly, he tried to reconcile them by persistently showing them that their mutual ruin would only increase the power of such men as Cicero, Catullus, and Cato, men whose influence would be nothing if Crassus and Pompey would only unite their friends and adherents, and with one might and one purpose direct the affairs of the city. He persuaded them, reconciled them, and won them both to support, and constituted with that triumvirate an irresistible power, with which he overthrew the Senate and the people, not by making his partners greater, the one through the other, but by making himself greatest of all through them. For owing to the support of both, he was at once triumphantly elected consul. And Plutarch's getting a little bit ahead of the story here, basically, spoiling the fact that Caesar will come out on top, and I'm pretty sure everybody already knows this. But yeah. It's worth noting that the first triumvirate was an entirely informal alliance. Unlike the second triumvirate, the first one had no legal framework or recognition. Rather, it merely describes the state of Roman politics from 60 BC to 53 BC, during which time the alliance between these three men was able to override any opposition from the Senate and people of Rome.
What I love about the first triumvirate is essentially Caesar coming there and say, listen, Jack, I know you hate John. John, I know you hate Jack. But if you two just got together with me, there is no one who could possibly stand against us. I know we all hate each other's guts. Bro, I would fuck you over in an instant, but we need each other. I know there's been decades of grudges, but we need each other. And the weird thing is it worked. Like, in stories, what's supposed to happen is that, like, the three start, like, infighting and bickering and it all kind of comes tumbling down because of that. But that's not exactly what happens. It actually just kind of worked for 7 years, and they were able to bully everybody.
Yeah.
Now, the power of the Triumvirate was put on display during the consular elections of 55 BC. Caesar had spent the past few years embarking on campaigns in Gaul. This is now France, and this is a thing that Caesar's pretty famous for, is his conquest in the region. And he was now required an extension to his command from the Senate. Now, Pompey and Crassus also wanted a sweet provincial posting to go earn some glory. And also, the position of governor was highly lucrative and offered opportunities, again, for conquest. The Senate, however, seemed unlikely to approve any of that. Caesar responded by encouraging Pompey and Crassus to run for consul once again. When their opponents in the Senate put forth their own candidates, the Triumvirate responded with violence. Alarmed at this, the partisans of Crassus and Pompey abstained from no disorder or violence, however extreme, and capped the climax by waylaying Dominus as he was coming down into the forum before daybreak with his followers, killing his torchbearer and wounding many, among whom was Cato. After routing their opponents and shutting them up at home, they had themselves proclaimed consuls, and a short time afterwards, they once more surrounded the rostra with armed men, cast Cato out of the forum, slew several who made resistance, and then had another 5 years added to the proconsulship of Caesar in Gaul, and the provinces of Syria and Spain voted to themselves. When the lot was cast, Syria fell to Crassus, and Spain to Pompey. So what they're saying is, essentially, like, as everyone was walking to go vote in the Senate for who was going to be consul, like, they got some of their gang members to grab people, killed the bodyguards who resisted, and shut them up in their homes so they couldn't vote. And then them and all their cronies voted themselves in charge, and then voted to themselves like the two most delicious, sacking-worthy places. Pompey's going to go to Spain, and Crassus is going to Syria. Meanwhile, Caesar's going to get a blank check to do whatever the fuck he wants in Gaul for another 5 years. Now, Cassius Dio also notes that not only were these provinces given to Crassus and Pompey, but the two also strong-armed the Roman government into giving them the authority to raise troops and engage in wars as they saw fit. So basically, the Triumvirate has now done explicit violence in government to seize power, given themselves the authority to raise troops and engage in war independent from the rest of the Roman government, but are now all three of them leaving Rome itself. Which seems like a great idea.
Yeah.
It's not a great idea. Not a good idea. Don't do it. It worked out this time, but not in the long run. Don't do it.
Now, it's thus in 55 BC, at the age of 60, that Crassus obtained his first provincial governorship, one that just happened to involve one of the wealthiest provinces in the entire republic.
I mean, it's Syria. Is where, wealth and civilization and empire was invented.
Yeah. To say that Crassus was pleased with his appointment would be an understatement. Apparently, he regarded being made governor of Syria as the best news in his entire life, and went about boasting about his goals to his friends and family. It's not hard to imagine why Crassus was so pleased. While he was one of the three leading men of Rome, he was increasingly being overshadowed by Pompey, and now even Caesar, due to their military accomplishments. Caesar's war in Gaul would also likely make him wealthier than Crassus as well, just as Pompey's war in the East had almost certainly done. Being governor of Syria alone afforded Crassus the ability not just to extract the considerable wealth of that territory, indeed one of his first actions was to plunder the temple in Jerusalem, but to embark on new conquests that, if successful, would have made Pompey's achievements look small in comparison.
So what we see here is by this point in history, relatively elderly man who is part of an alliance that only works because they're equals, seeing himself fall behind his younger colleagues and feels his pride insulted. Wants to get up there and fucking remind him who fucking kicked ass in his glory days. And I'm going to go and I'm going to loot the fuck out of Syria and I'm going to get my dominant position again. It's all going to be fine. Now, the eastern border of what the Romans called Syria lay across the Euphrates River. And on the other side of that river lay Mesopotamia, which was then the westernmost portion of the vast Parthian Empire. Parthian Empire was founded by the Parni, a nomadic Central Asian tribe who conquered the region of Parthia, which is modern-day northeast Iran and Turkmenistan, in the 3rd century BC from the Seleucids. The Parthians went on to conquer the bulk of the Seleucid Empire and assumed the title of King of Kings that was first established by the original Achaemenid Persian dynasty. This is just one of the many, we often talk about like the Persian empires. They're called a bunch of different names. There's technically different ethnic groups like running them, but for a mass swath of history, there is an army based out of what we now call the Persia region, fucking everybody up and doing imperial shit all over. But technically who's in charge keeps changing in and out. But right now it's the Parthians. Up until this point, the Parthians and Romans have maintained a neutral disposition towards each other. But the Roman conquest of Pontus and the subjugation of Armenia meant that the two expansionist powers now shared substantial borders with each other. Armenia does just love being in the middle of land grabbing between much stronger states. It's like its favorite thing. No, they don't enjoy it. In spite of Parthia's, they're just very good at it. In spite of Parthia's vast size, it seems as if Crassus thought the Parthians is merely another eastern power for Rome to defeat. If Pontus, Armenia, and the Seleucids could be defeated, why not the Parthians? It'd be easy. Come on. Crassus' confidence was likely furthered by the fact that the Parthian Empire was currently undergoing a major internal political crisis caused by a succession struggle between the king, Orotus II, and his brother. The Romans would have been aware of this struggle because the king's brother requested Roman assistance in this fight, so it's not like Crassus is totally delusional when he thinks this is the time to strike.
Yeah, Parthia looked ripe for the taking, and if Crassus could conquer it, he could push even further east, truly becoming the new Alexander that Pompey and Caesar often fashioned themselves to be. Quoting from Plutarch again, quote, "He would not consider Syria, nor even Parthia, as the boundaries of his success. But he thought to make the campaigns of Lucullus against Tigranes and those of Pompey against Mithridates seem mere child's play, and flew on the wings of his hopes as far as Bactria and India and the outer sea." Yeah, basically the whole Alexander 2.0 stuff.
Yeah, he's gonna take it all.
Yeah.
The outer sea is a great designation, especially if you're like a time in history where the like your understanding of the planet and the world is like, well, there's like an ocean over there, and past that, well, it's the outer one.
Yeah. Truth be told, we can't know for sure what Crassus was thinking. Plutarch himself could only guess, and the same is true for us. The outcome of the Triumvirate period often leads people to believe that the three triumvirs were essentially fighting over the right to remake Rome in their own image, as Augustus would eventually do. Personally, I think out of the three members of the first triumvirate, Caesar is the only one who probably had those ambitions. Excited or not, Crassus was a smart man. He would have been well aware that his age meant that he really didn't have that much time left ahead of him. My guess is that Crassus is basically just stuck in the endless loop of competition between him and the other leading men of Rome, most notably Pompey. More victories, more wealth, more slaves, more triumphs, etc. are what he was focused on, even if he didn't have any real plans for using that capital. It's also potentially possible that he wanted to establish his family as the most powerful one in Rome for the sake of his sons, who had already embarked on their own military and political careers by then.
I think it's probably worth noting that, for those who aren't aware, Crassus is kind of considered a loser in history, or a fool. He's made fun of. One of in 10th grade, I had to watch Crash Course World History, and John Green made fun of Crassus. And I think that we kind of see what Julius Caesar did, aka, and Augustus Caesar, kicking over the power sharing of Rome and centralizing power. And then we kind of look back and we see how there were, several centuries of norms breaking down before that happened. And we kind of then say, oh, well, eventually there was going to be someone who kicked the door down and actually just centralized power and became dictator. And we then kind of judge everyone who isn't Caesar and Augustus for not doing that or failing to do that. And which is partially why Pompey and Crassus get judged so harshly, when that is maybe doing an order of operations that is leading you to color your view far too much. Jay, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I would agree. Crassus obviously was fine bullying the Senate to get what he wanted, but I don't think he ever wanted to replace the Senate or fully overhaul it or anything. If you compare it to what Sulla did, earlier on, what the first triumvirate has done up to this point is fairly limited. We didn't mention it, but Sulla, passes a whole bunch of reforms and everything, basically trying to reduce the power of the tribune of the plebs and does stuff like that. And Crassus doesn't do any of this stuff. I don't think he has this idea that I'm going to be the leader of Rome and establish a new dynasty or anything. He just wants to be powerful and wealthy. And when other people are more powerful and wealthy, he wants to overtake them. And in a way, I was kind of talking about this before we started this episode, but he reminds me a lot about modern billionaires who could easily just retire and live, the rest of their lives with their absurd amount of wealth, because whether you're worth 1 billion or 10 billion doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter.
Does not. Why does Elon Musk not fucking buy an island in the fucking South Pacific Ocean and start building Gundams or doing Battle Royale or whatever the fuck? There's no need for him to do anything else other than just weirdo, hedonistic, fun shit with the people that he loves and enjoys the rest of his life. And yet he decided that the best use of his resources was to become the face of one of the corporations on Earth with the lowest public perception.
Yeah.
He chose to do that. Everything that you see him doing, CEO of Twitter, and he brought that on himself. He asked for that.
Yeah.
Because this is what people who who are allowed to act like fucking gods do, is they don't stop. Because their whole belief in themselves is wrapped up in them being the best, them being indestructible, them in being worshipped. And the fact of the matter is, there will always come along a new person who's not even better than you, just another person who does significant things, because no one can do all the significant things because you are not the fucking main character. And because they're so empty and hollow, besides the vapid glory of their accomplishments, their internal calibrations just can't fucking handle that. So they need another hit of that love of the masses. Also, getting divorced is hard.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's like, that to me, a lot of that applies to Crassus, where I think, like, he could have retired. He's absurdly wealthy. One of the guys we mentioned once earlier in a quote is Lucullus. Lucullus was a general who defeated the Armenians. And Lucullus made a shit ton of money, got politically outmaneuvered, his command was given to Pompey, and then Lucullus just retires and lives in his villa the rest of his life, being one of the wealthiest Romans. And that's why, like, nobody talks about Lucullus. And
good for Lucullus.
yeah, it's, Crassus could have totally done that, but not because he has some, like, grand political ideology or anything, just because he has to be the best. Like, he'll go and do everything we're about to describe. But yeah, whatever the motivation might have been, raising an army isn't something you can do in secret. Indeed, that Crassus was intent on going to war with Parthia was essentially an open secret even before he left Rome for Syria. And he was probably, putting out recruitment and gathering officers and stuff like that, so word would get out. Now, one of the tribunes of the plebs, one of those magistrates, as well as an angry mob, attempted to stop him from leaving the capital due to their opposition for such an unprovoked war. And the resistance was so fierce that Crassus had to rely on the assistance of Pompey to mollify the crowd. With that dealt with, Crassus was free to set about his plans.
Yeah, because this would be one of the most significant campaigns that Rome had undertaken since the wars against Carthage, right?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's the biggest power they fought. Yeah, it's the biggest power they fought since Carthage.
It was another proper empire.
Yeah.
Okay. So as soon as Crassus arrived in Syria in 55 BC, he set about raising an army of 7 legions. Crassus' forces crossed the Euphrates River the following year, quickly defeating a small Parthian army and seizing several towns in Mesopotamia without much of a fight. At the end of the year, the Romans withdrew from Mesopotamia to winter in Syria, leaving behind small garrisons in their newly conquered territory. That was probably just to make sure they could feed all their men, I imagine. Yeah. Plutarch notes that Crassus' failure to push towards Babylon and Seleucia in southern Mesopotamia in 54 was his first major error, as such regions were historically hostile to Parthian rule and likely would have welcomed the Romans. Still, things were seemingly going quite well for Crassus by the end of the year. While wintering in Syria, the king of Armenia, Artabaeus II, I like that name, approached Crassus with a proposal. Artabaeus proposed that Crassus ally with Armenia and invade Parthia through his country. Not only could he provide the Romans with an additional 16,000 cavalry and 30,000 infantry, he pointed out that Armenia's mountainous terrain was less favorable to the Parthian horse-based armies than the open expanses of Mesopotamia. Crassus committed his second major offer by turning down Artabaeus' offer. Crassus likely felt content with his accomplishments in Mesopotamia so far. The Parthians had barely put up a fight to this point. Clearly, they were just another lesser power for Rome to brush aside. With his offer turned down, Artabaeus departed Syria and returned to Armenia. You turned down 30,000 infantry? What the fuck is wrong with you?
And for context, that would have doubled the size of Crassus's army, essentially.
That is a very large, that is a massive army for the standards of the day. And for the standards of the day going forward 1,000 years. 1,500 years.
And also, Artabaeus is, spoiler alert, going to be very right that infantry would have done a lot better going around the mountains through Armenia than what Crassus will end up doing. Because the Parthians are a cavalry-based army, and horses don't do very well in mountains. Yeah, another less friendly envoy reached Crassus in the winter of 54 BC, this one from the Parthian Empire. A Parthian ambassador from the court of King Orodes II came to Crassus with simple terms. If Crassus withdrew his army and returned all conquered territory east of the Euphrates, then all would be forgotten, and Orodes would be happy to return to a state of peace with Rome. Crassus naturally turned down this offer, countering that he would soon be able to dictate terms to Orodes in Seleucia. Seleucia was the old capital of the Seleucid Empire and was being used as a capital by the Parthians.
Basically saying I'll see you when I kick your door down.
Yeah. Crassus resumed his campaign against the Parthians the following year, crossing the Euphrates once again. Unbeknownst to Crassus, King Orodes had divided his forces in two. Orodes, with the bulk of the Parthian army, had departed towards Armenia, intent on eliminating Artabazus as a threat and preventing any attack from that vector. A smaller army under the command of a Parthian nobleman named Serena had been sent first to capture Orodes' brother, which he did, and then slow down Crassus. So I do like how the Parthian king actually thinks that the Armenians are the bigger threat at this point.
Or that they've already teamed up with...
Yeah,
He anticipated his opponent to do the logical thing.
Yeah, it would have been the smarter thing to do. Now, Crassus was intent on defeating the Parthians, and was emboldened by the reports of scouts who had reported encountering fleeing Parthians and seeing the horse prints of a retreating army, as well as intelligence from a local chieftain who was secretly working for the Parthians. Together, this information conveniently pointed the Romans away from the more infantry-friendly terrain near the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, and towards the open desert near Carrhae. Now, Carrhae, for modern reference, is in the southeastern part of Turkey, just above the Syrian border. So that's kind of where we're talking about. And if you go a little bit north of that, you have the Taurus Mountains. If you go south, you have more open, flat, terrain. Crassus's subordinates were pretty aware that this plan was risky, and they advised caution. Gaius Cassius Longinus, who was one of Crassus's legates, advised Crassus to focus instead on fortifying the towns they had already captured, or to continue their campaign down south along the banks of the Euphrates, as the river could be used to supply the army and prevent it from being encircled. Crassus turned down this advice. Through a combination of errors and overconfidence, he set about leading his men right into a trap.
Doing a quick look, this place kind of looks like the Mediterranean version of Nevada. If you've ever been around the southwestern United States, imagine that, but like a little more Mediterranean spiced up. It's kind of the terrain where we're getting at. Lots of low brushes, some desert, some forests, but very prickly. Lots of hills. As Crassus approached the vicinity of Carrhae, he had at his disposal a full 7 legions, roughly 35,000 infantry, accompanied by a further 4,000 auxiliary light infantry and 4,000 cavalry, including 1,000 Gallic horsemen on loan from Caesar and under the command of Crassus' youngest son, Publius. People be out here just naming their kids Publius, who had served in Caesar's war in Gaul. Jay, what do we need to know about this Roman army?
Yeah, so if you've listened to our episode on the Teutoburg Forest, we talk a lot about the Roman army of the early empire then. The late Republican army is kind of similar, but the unfortunate fact is there's a lot we actually don't know about the late Republican army. It's in this weird transitional period from going from a conscript army in like the time of the Punic Wars to the professional army we know for the empire. And like 50 years ago, historians would have said that Gaius Marius did his Marian reforms and that, instantly Rome had a professional standing army. Nowadays, most historians don't think that's true. They're in again, I'm going to sound very vague because we just don't know a lot about how these armies were raised or recruited. But basically, people like Crassus or Caesar or Pompey would seemingly just put out a notice that we're going to war. They would probably call upon their veterans who've served with them before to serve as the core of the army.
And they would advertise the pay, what we were going to get, the lands you would get for serving.
Yeah, and then people would join in for the hope of pay and plunder and stuff like that.
Now, would those people generally bring their own gear, or would it be bought for them by the patron, by the Crassus?
Generally a mix of both.
I mean, obviously, if you had stuff you liked, you'd probably bring it.
Yeah, I think it's generally a mix of both. But basically, they're not as fully professional as what we'll have in the time of Augustus. So
I do like the idea of imperial conquest operating just on the basis of, hey, we're putting some boys together. You in?
Yeah.
Just like a 50,000 getting the boys together. I'm assembling a team.
Yeah. Then you would also have units who've been on campaign for a while, like Caesar's entire army in Gaul, who are by that point obviously very professional. Crassus's forces seemed more mixed.
And by professional, you mean people who have been soldiers for a long time and mostly made most of their money in their adult lives soldiering, not farmers who have been conscripted or have just signed up.
Yes, yeah. Now, opposing the Romans was Surena's Parthian army of around 10,000 cavalry, of which 9,000 were horse archers and 1,000 were heavily armored cataphracts.
What
the Parthians
you're going to have to explain what a cataphracts are.
Yeah, so a cataphract is just a term used by a lot of cultures from this era for heavy cavalry. These cataphracts are people who, the riders will be armored in mail or scale. Their horses will generally also be armored in mail or scale, and they'll be armed with spears, the lances.
So they're like Middle Eastern knights, kind of.
Yes.
Cool.
And they would make up the small amount of the shock heavy cavalry. The bulk of the army would be these horse archers. The Parthians, a lot of these people from Central Asia, are a horse archer-based, military force. They're adept at riding around, shooting arrows, whether advancing or retreating and everything. If you know about the Huns or Mongols, it's fairly similar. Now, after his scouts encountered the enemy, Crassus began to deploy his men in a wide line, a formation that had proved effective for the Romans in defeating the Armenians a decade prior. But then he changes his mind and orders his men to form a hollow defensive square. You basically have an equal amount of men on all sides and just kind of open in the center.
But doesn't that assume that the enemy is going to hit you equally from all sides at once?
Yeah.
That's not how anything works.
The Romans, I think, at this point are not... I mean, this is their first major battle with the Parthians. This is one of their earlier battles with a horse army-based enemy. They don't have a ton of experience fighting really entirely cavalry enemies.
Really?
So I think that at this point in time they don't. They will get it. But
I guess we kind of forget that after the wars with Carthage, the battles, the Romans were doing a lot of fighting slave rebels and dudes in the woods, fighting a few dozen at a time, conquest. They were not really used to full-on warfare.
Yeah, they'll fight Pontus and Armenia, but those countries had like more mixed armies where they'd have like mixed cavalry infantry. And they fight like some small tribes like Scythians or whatever, but like not a big enemy like the Parthians who are practicing this kind of warfare.
And in a region of the world that had been practicing this kind of warfare for over 1,000 years at this point.
Yeah. So Crassus's subordinates, again, advised caution, stating that they should set up camp for the night next to a nearby stream. But Crassus instead ordered the square to march forwards towards the supposed location of the Parthians. Now, Sulla, for his part, seemed more than happy to give battle to Crassus on his terms and prepared his cavalry to attack the Romans. While the Parthians were outnumbered, remember it's about 10,000 on their side versus about 40,000 in total Romans, they were able to intimidate the Romans through their traditional methods of psychological warfare. Quoting from Plutarch, "The Parthians do not incite themselves to battle with horns or trumpets, but they have hollow drums of distended hide covered with bronze bells, and on these they beat all at once in many quarters, and the instruments give forth a low and dismal tone, a blend of a wild beast's roar and harsh thunder peal. They had rightly judged that, of all the senses, hearing is the one most apt to confound the soul, soonest to rouse its emotions, and most effectively unseats the judgment. While the Romans were in consternation at this din, suddenly their enemies dropped the coverings of their armor, and were seen to be blazing in helmets and breastplates, their Marganian steel glittering keen and bright, and their horses clad in plates of bronze and steel."
Yo, my boys coming at them with the drum corps. This is straight up marching band shit. He's basically describing snare drums. Like, he's basically describing a rudimentary medieval snare drum.
Yeah.
Which can be terrifying and very, very loud in large numbers. And then, like, you know, you're throwing off your cloaks and you're flashing your colors and you go, and then you yell, "Wolfpack Pride!"
I don't think they yell that, but yes.
Yo, this is great. So the Parthians, all geared up from their pep rally, charge the Roman square. But instead of crashing into it, they instead divide and surround the Romans on both sides, their light cavalry firing arrows into the densely packed Roman formation. Roman armies were used to dealing with arrows, of course. Typically, the large shields and strong armor of Roman infantry will allow them to weather the hail of arrows and continue fighting. You know, archers could only carry so many arrows, and they'll run out. The Parthians surrounding Crassus' army, however, didn't seem to be running out of arrows. Their deadly hail persisted, as unbeknownst to Crassus, Sulla had brought along with his army a camel-mounted supply train laden with arrows. Good idea. The Parthian horsemen were able to discharge their arrows against the Romans, quickly ride over to the camels to resupply, and then ride back and continue their attack. Even if the vast majority of arrows were stopped by Roman shields or armor, with so many being fired, more than a few were bound to find their mark. So this is basically forcing Crassus to make a move or just get picked apart.
Yeah.
So a charge by the Roman auxiliary infantry is easily just getting repulsed by Parthian archers. And while his men are still arranged in a large infantry square, they are slowly but consistently taking losses from this seemingly unending rain of Parthian arrows, and Crassus has to do something. So he decides to send his son Publius out with 1,300 cavalry and 4,000 infantry to charge the Parthians and attempt to force a battle. Okay, a light attack didn't work, let's do a heavier attack. The Parthian center retreated away from this force, luring it away from the square before wheeling around and crushing it. The bulk of this force, including Publius, were killed.
Publius's charge did buy the main Roman army a period of brief respite. The sight of the Parthian horsemen seemingly fleeing the battle gave them some confidence, and the rain of arrows lessened as many of the archers had departed to deal with Publius. This respite would prove to be short-lived when the main force of the Parthians returned. A Parthian cavalryman affixed Publius's head to the tip of his spear and rode around in front of the Roman lines, displaying it to them, further weakening the Roman morale. Crassus, to his credit, did not immediately break down upon hearing about the death of his son, but instead tried to motivate his men by beseeching them to avenge Publius. His efforts failed, and as night began to fall, most of the Romans seemed to have already realized that the battle was lost. The Parthian armies, like most ancient armies, typically did not fight at night, and as such withdrew from the field as the sun set, confident in their ability to finish off the Romans the following day.
I feel like modern folk really forget how dark it used to be.
Yeah.
Like, it was not until I was like, I think 10 or 11 years old, I was like staying out with my grandparents in the country, that I like experienced pitch darkness, and it terrified me. Do you remember the first time you experienced pitch darkness?
Not off the top of my head, no, but I have experienced it.
But, like, yeah, it's not like a really moonlit night. Can't fucking see shit on dick. And then you light a torch, and then that completely ruins your night vision. So you're also kind of still not seeing shit on dick. And, just don't do it. Just don't trust the professionals. Don't do night fighting. Fall back. They'll still be there.
Yeah. Now it's at this point that Crassus seems to have finally broken down. He gave no orders to his men and instead lay silent on the ground.
This is actually makes a lot of sense from a psychological standpoint. Because while he's fighting, the adrenaline's in him. You never cry during. I have been in a sparring match, not a real fight. I have been kicked in the face. Like, I had my gums. I had a guard in. Don't worry. I have like taken a foot in the jaw. No pain. Like at the contact. Just bopped around. Really, I wanted to keep hitting, but I walked off the floor to wash the blood out of my mouth guard. But when your body helps you focus with adrenaline, it really is to prevent you from being killed by just not being distracted, not being panicked, just going. But when the immediate threat is gone and the adrenaline leaves your brain and the exhaustion kicks in and your 60 kicks in, that's when oh fuck.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what happens. And because of that, his legates, Cassius and Octavius, take command of the situation, and they decide to retreat through the night to the walled town of Carrhae, which was being held by a Roman garrison. The retreat began with haste, with anyone too injured to walk, which was around 4,000 men, being left to their fate.
The retreat to Carrhae proved to be a disorganized affair, with the Romans stopping numerous times thinking they were under attack, and with several units splitting from the main force and getting lost in the darkness of night. Again, it's very dark. Still, the core of the army, including Crassus, was able to make it to Carrhae. As the sun rose, the Parthians renewed their attack by killing all the injured Romans who had been abandoned by the main army, and hunting down the various stragglers who had gotten lost or fallen behind during the night. Sulla then came upon Carrhae and sent an envoy to propose negotiations with Crassus. Plutarch notes that this was a trick. Sulla was not aware if Crassus had fled elsewhere, and only planned on laying siege to Carrhae if he was present. Crassus accepted the proposal, essentially confirming his presence there, and Sulla brought up his army to prepare to lay siege to Carrhae. As we said, Carrhae was a walled town, but it did not have supplies to last a long siege. The Romans thus decided to split up and retreat before the Parthians fully surrounded the town, once again using the cover of darkness. Some Roman detachments, including the one led by Cassius, managed to make their way to safety. The group containing Crassus, however, was unable to make much progress and was caught by Sulla's men the following day. Surena's men caught up to Crassus as his small detachment was able to make their way up into an area of more mountainous terrain. Knowing that the Romans could still conceivably shake off their pursuits in such terrain, Surena again proposed negotiations and loudly proclaimed to the Romans that he was willing to offer them safe passage home. Crassus thought to refuse, but his men, now seeing their only way out, forced him to speak with the Parthian general. What ensued can only be described as weird. Pause.
Yeah.
So, Jay, I imagine, so you said there was a detachment led by Cassius that got away. I imagine most of what we know about the battle that and everything that's happened so far is from those guys, those survivors.
And there are a few other like small amounts who make their who get out as well. And that's, probably weird.
So I imagine one of the reasons why this is weird is because it is reported from other sources and it's like less clear or secondhand.
Yeah, a lot of what's following is like Plutarch's probably getting from hearsay, and it's like it's not crazy. It's just like when you read about Crassus, like this is not the ending I was expecting. Because like I knew about the Battle of Carrhae before I started doing research for this episode. It's a very famous Roman battle, very famous defeat. But I didn't know like the full story of what happens at the end. And it was just kind of surprising to me that like this is how Crassus dies.
Okay, well, let's talk about it. Upon seeing Crassus on foot, Surena declared that it was improper for a Roman general to be forced to walk on foot and had a horse brought up for him. People like this do these honored things all the time. So far, not too weird. After Crassus was mounted upon a horse, the Parthian grooms began to beat the horse and make it run wildly. The likeliest explanation for this is that Surena sought to further embarrass Crassus. But the Romans took it poorly and tried to arrest the horse's movements. The Parthians in turn tried to stop them, and a heavily armed scuffle ensued. When all was said and done, several Romans and Parthians lay dead, including Crassus. But like, this was not a battle. This was not a slaughter. What?
He basically just dies in like a fight. That's what it is. Like it's kind of just a weird thing that happens. Whereas like I am assuming that Surena
one of the triumvirs, the powers of Rome, does not die in the field, does not die in the retreat, is not executed in his failures, but like limps away after massive mistakes, and then while attempting to surrender, dies in a weird brawl.
Yeah.
Well, no one is competent.
My assumption is that Surena would execute him anyways, but like we don't really know, and like I'm just assuming that like Surena was doing something to just embarrass him, be like, this guy can't even ride a horse properly, which, you know, to the Parthians, being a horse riding culture like is a big deal.
Yeah, and you hear about him like displaying like the sun's head on a spear. Guy seems to have a little bit of a flair for the dramatic.
Yeah, and I left it out, but like Plutarch describes how he's dressed in a Median fashion. You know, the Medians being very ancient, even by that time, people who were around in the area before the Persians, and how he had like an effeminate beauty and like all like his hair done up and everything. So Surena is a showman.
We stan a king with a strong aesthetic.
Yeah. Now, whatever Surena's intentions with Crassus were, he had achieved his goal. The Roman invasion of Mesopotamia had been crushed, and all remaining garrisons were forced to flee back across the Euphrates. According to Plutarch, Surena's messenger brought Crassus's head back to King Herodes. Also, again, this is when Plutarch's really relying on hearsay. I wouldn't be surprised if most of this is made up, just because like it very much just fits the storytelling aspect.
A lot of Roman history is made up.
Yeah. Allegedly, you know, the messenger presents the head to the king as the king is enjoying a performance of the Bacchae, which is a Greek tragedy written by Euripides. And the Bacchae is a tragedy in which a guy gets torn to shreds. So, again, like, this could have happened.
this could just be like poetic
or they're trying to
license.
do like a dramatic irony thing.
Yeah. And the Armenian king is also attending this play. The two had reconciled. Now, Cassius Dio doesn't mention any Greek tragedies, but instead relays the oft-repeated story of the Parthians pouring molten gold down Crassus's throat in mockery of his wealth. Though it should be noted that in Dio's story, Crassus is already dead when they do this, so I think some people have the image of like them killing Crassus by pouring gold down his throat. Doesn't seem to have been the case.
We would have to wait for season 1 of Game of Thrones for that.
Yeah. And like Plutarch, like again, like described, goes into like detail about like the actors in the play like grab the head and incorporate it into the play and stuff like that. And like that's when it's kind of like, I think he's just taking poetic license. But yeah. Now, Serena himself would not outlive Crassus by long. Orodes II, suspicious of his ambitions, had him executed for treason.
Well,
yeah, Cassius would go on to be one of the chief conspirators against Julius Caesar. He's one of the guys who stabs him, as well as the enemy of Augustus. He ends up dying at the Battle of Philippi.
if I were a bad person who read 48 Rules of Power, I would say never outshine the master. But I'm not. And if you meet anyone who's read that book, don't talk to them.
Crassus's eldest son, Marcus, who was not at battle, presumably inherits his vast wealth and went on to have a pretty unremarkable career in politics. And after that, this line of the family kind of fades into obscurity as the Republic turns into an empire. Carrhae would go down as one of the greatest defeats in Roman military history. Out of an army of 40,000 men, 20,000 were killed and a further 10,000 captured. Almost all of the legionary eagles were lost. And in fact, if you've ever seen a statue of Augustus, you've probably seen the famous ones called the Prima Porta.
Is that the one where there's the baby on his ankle?
Yeah. But also on his breastplate, there's a decoration of somebody giving legionary eagles to him. And that's actually Augustus negotiating with the Parthians to have the eagles returned. Like, was such a big deal that ends up on his breastplate in the statue.
Yes.
Yeah. Crassus's war would be only the first in a series of wars between Rome and Parthia that would last for 2 centuries. And if you expand it out to their successor states, the Sassanid Persians and the Byzantines, like, these wars will continue until the 600s. Now, Crassus's death has a potentially destabilizing effect on the political situation back in Rome. It's kind of hard to really determine exactly like how destabilizing it is. Obviously, there's no more Triumvirate because one of them is dead, but Caesar and Pompey don't immediately like go to war with each other or anything. There is, still a lull period of a fair amount more years.
Yeah, that's how it's generally taught. It was taught to me in school. Like, Crassus got himself killed like a dipshit, and then with the Triumvirate shattered, now Caesar and Pompey have to go to war.
Yeah, I think, we could say that with it only being 2, that might have made conflict more likely because, now you can be like, well, I can go to war with the other guy and I don't have to worry about the third guy. But it'll be some years before the 2 come to blows. And yeah, the whole fall of the Republic, again, that's something which we could go on in another episode. We're not going to do that here. But I think Plutarch summarizes Crassus's undoing quite well when he describes his lament after the first day of the battle. Again, this is when Crassus is just sitting in the dark after the first day of fighting and not doing anything. Quote, "But he was lying on the ground by himself, enveloped in darkness, to the multitude an illustration of the ways of fortune, but to the wise an example of foolish ambition, which would not let him rest satisfied to be first and greatest among many myriads of men, but made him think, because he was judged inferior to 2 men only, that he lacked everything.
Damn.
Yeah. Yeah. And that kind of gets to my point where, like, I think Plutarch's right about this, where it's like, because of that competition with Caesar and Pompey, that even though Crassus has everything he could ever use in life, that wasn't enough.
Well, Jay, does that do it?
I think that does it.
I think that does it. We've already said a lot, and I think yeah. I am somewhat comforted by the fact that human personalities that you see today can also be seen in ancient times. The fact that humans haven't changed that much. I'm actually kind of comforted by that. And, yeah. Bitches be bitches, no matter what time of, history there are. Anyway, once again, you can follow us at Azalea Wyatt on Twitter and at Jaharis48. Watch Bloom, it's fucking good. Our music, credit to the legendary Sam Bryce. We're getting out of here. Y'all be good.